How's everyone doing? I'm excited to be here. Now, I have to say right at the beginning, who's heard of BBG? Honest show of hands. Okay, wow, it's a lot more than usual. All right, so Broadcasting Board of Governors. Really honored to be with you kind of hand in hand to talk about such an important subject. And I want to open with what I think of as one of the greatest disinformation warriors of the past century, Nelson Mandela. He said that leadership is a choice. And I believe that our storytellers, our journalists that take on that ethos every day with you hand in hand are out there sort of on the front lines, courageous, and oftentimes putting their lives on the line to show that kind of leadership. So as part of Broadcasting Board of Governors, we're in 58 languages. As you know, it's Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, off of Cuba Broadcasting, Middle East Broadcasting Network. And we're out there sort of, as I said, trying to understand this challenge. So I want to talk a little bit about what I think of are the sort of the main disinformation challenges, what we're seeing in terms of the research, and then talk a little bit about what we're doing. So what are we seeing out there in the research? One is that we're seeing that state-sponsored disinformation, they live by this mantra. And the mantra is the following. The narrower the audience, the bigger the impact. All right? So there's a lot of work that we're finding state-sponsored disinformation actors are putting into audience segmentation. And what we find is that this gets into sort of the media literacy question, which I want to tackle here today, to thinking a little bit about how do they target those audiences. All right. I'm going to figure this out. All right. So we have basically, if you look at media literacy, we find pretty strong correlation, and I would make the case some causation, where you find low media literacy in certain communities, which does not make them resilient to disinformation. So we've done some studies on this that I can talk about offline, but we find in countries where there's low media literacy, places like Italy, places like Romania, that actually you find that where information travels further in terms of disinformation, misinformation, that you actually have citizens that are unable to sort of cut through that noise. Okay. The other thing is is that when we think about disinformation, the other piece of this is we oftentimes talk about the Kremlin playbook, state-sponsored playbook of what the Russians are doing. And what we find in terms of the content and distribution in Russian language is that I think what oftentimes gets ignored is that they have a hyper-local strategy. What do I mean by hyper-local strategy? It's that they actually are oftentimes, a lot of their disinformation, misinformation is on hyper-local stories in municipalities, in towns. Right, which a lot of times bigger media news agencies don't cover, right? And again, they think carefully about who are the audiences, what are the vulnerable groups that they're trying to target, what are the groups that they're really sort of trying to reach with this disinformation. And again, we focus a lot on the Kremlin, sort of Kremlin-sponsored, but if I was just to say the top 10 languages, give me some examples. Top 10 languages of where we have increasing trends of disinformation, state-sponsored disinformation. Tell me, what's that? Spanish, okay. Yes, what else? Russian. We wanted something else on Russian. I'm trying to get some other languages. Turkish, yeah. Yep, Mandarin, yeah. There's a couple more I want people to mention they haven't mentioned yet. Tamil, not in the top 10, but it's getting increasingly. What's that, Arabic? Yeah, Arabic. What's that? Tagalog, someone said? Yes, Farsi. Yes, Farsi. And a couple that you haven't mentioned, which again, I want to mention because we, over the next, I think, 2 days, can talk about this. Rohingya, Uyghur, okay, Urdu, all right. We mentioned Farsi. Now, a lot of these are smaller languages, right? Niche languages, not huge, but what we're finding is that more and more state-sponsored are realizing, again, these narrow audiences, these segmented audiences, they're realizing, and we obviously operate in a lot of those languages. A lot of our journalists are in jail. A lot of our Uyghur journalists, their families have been put in jail in China because they are tackling this every day. The other thing I want to sort of get at is that again, in terms of challenges, we have the media literacy issue, which we're trying to tackle. We have content and distribution, which I mentioned in terms of the Kremlin state-sponsored. Every state-sponsored kind of has its own playbook. There's things you can look at it in terms of backfire effect or in terms of how they're trying to get across information. But third is in terms of censorship. right? We'll talk a lot about censorship and the new tools that state-sponsored actors are using to make sure that citizens can't access information. Now, we operate on all three at BBG across all of our network. Our journalists who are on the front lines, and I really do think of this as I would say an information battlefield, because there's no borders on this arena, as many of us know. So we're trying to tackle all three, and I would make the case that we're doing something I think that is quite innovative. So one thing that we've launched that's become increasingly popular is something called Polygraph. So Polygraph, anyone heard of Polygraph? All right, not enough people, but we're going to increase that over the next few days. So Polygraph and its sort of cousin Factograph, it's looking at the Russian language media space. And essentially, it's scoring sort of Russian language media, right? Not quite a Rotten Tomatoes for news, but it's basically trying to sort of say, look, here's a story. Is it partially true? Is it misleading? What is it about this? What is the sourcing on this story? And we found incredible kind of responsiveness to this, okay? We found that actually we've had month-on-month increasing number of visitors, and not just folks that are Russian language speaking. We've had other language markets that are tapping into this to see if they can find it in their language, right? It's become a helpful tool. And we've seen the demand, again, continue to increase. And we've found actually that a lot of the Russian language media is now trying to respond to us. There's backlash from the RTs and the Sputniks, right? In terms of now how we're covering their stories. Because in some ways we can also drive people towards our content. So we actually want to take this, and hopefully in the workshops we'll talk about it today, but we actually want to take this and scale it up across 8 languages. And ideally, if you ask me, our vision over the next year, in the next few years, is we'd like to do it over 58 languages. Because in a lot of smaller languages, this is where we have a competitive advantage. Where yet it's not yet commercial, but we can actually make the case and provide increased media literacy. The other big piece of what we do is on circumvention. And so, as many of you might know, we sponsor tools like Siphon through the Office of Internet Freedom. We also have the Open Technology Fund that's also part of the BBG family, which is basically we're trying to reach folks, and as state-sponsored get more sophisticated in using tools and figuring out surveillance, they're actually cracking down. So, for example, this past spring, during the Iran protest, the height of the protest, right? Iranian telecom providers were out there trying to sort of shut down the ability for ordinary citizens to get their voices out. We had about 800,000 people per day accessing our technology at the height of the protests. And we've seen those numbers continue to spike, not just Mandarin speakers, but Farsi speakers, Urdu language speakers. In Cambodia, all over, we're seeing this sort of the rise in this. And so we're trying to look for new tools that we can provide to folks and think about new ways to empower our citizen journalists. And again, a lot of the surveillance tools are getting more sophisticated that actually, a lot of journalists are going missing. A lot of them are oftentimes putting their life on the line. So we're trying to think about how do we keep ahead of that curve? How do we actually have a tool that can get out to people that can use it, that's accessible? Because there's a lot of technology out there, but it's almost too sophisticated to sort of scale it up. So on all 3 of these dimensions, again, as I mentioned, media literacy, both in terms of trainings, in terms of our independent fact-based reporting, in terms of what we talked about here, in terms of the content, in terms of getting our stories out. And we'll talk a little bit later, hopefully in the workshops, about some of the AI and machine learning tools that are being used to sort of accompany, Voice of China. Does anyone know the Voice of China? Right? Just announced Xi Jinping's legacy in this information statecraft battle. It's going to be the largest public broadcaster in the world, that he's going to be doing over a dozen languages, and it's a conglomerate of all the state-sponsored TV and radio. So they're going to continue to get involved, but everybody's putting investments in that. Lastly, I have a fantastic team, and I want you to meet all of them. So please, can you raise your hands if you're from BBG here today? Come meet one of these people all around the room. We want to work together.